Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you guys all had a good weekend. We're getting back into it. We're discussing more of the development of arts and culture on the path to the modern world. So today we're going to be talking about the Romantics. And in the future, we'll also talk about sort of things like the scientific revolution, the world wars, various things going on in the world. But right now, we're kind of taking it by sort of thematic topics, the history of ideas, the history of the way people are thinking about things and what they are doing, and what kind of art is being made out of those things. So that's kind of where we're at right now. And then we'll switch over to some more specifically historical topics after that. But today I want to talk about the Romantics. So the Romantics are going to be the topic for the next 3 days here, based on the next 3 chapters. As you can see, there's a lot to cover. But today we're going to be talking about the Romantics and their love of nature. So the Romantics were kind of a backlash to the very logical, optimistic view of the Enlightenment. Although they were optimistic in their own way, they just rejected the sort of very rational, methodical way of thinking about the world, in part because they saw some of the hypocrisies of it, some of the problems inherent in it, and inherent in the way that the people in these supposedly enlightened societies were treating people outside of those societies. Romanticism can be seen as a backlash, a response to all that. But what is it? So when we say romanticism, romantic usually conjures up images of romance, right? Of love, of passion for other people. We didn't really have that term until after this point, and it came to mean something different. So if we go far back enough, romanticism has a lot to do with the Romans themselves. So the Romans being sort of having this way of looking at the world. Now, the funny thing is, the Enlightenment era folks drew on the Romans too. They saw them as representing all that was sort of serious and rational and logical. But for the folks of the Romantic movement, they all actually saw the Romans as being much more about emotion and passion. And so that was the kind of art that they wanted to do and the way they responded to all of the stuff of the Romantics. Now, Romanticism came along basically in the 1800s, so we're moving right along here. We are in the 1800s to the 1850s, just about. And this is the time period where the Industrial Revolution is really taking place throughout Europe. So things are changing, and we'll get into that when we discuss sort of the art and ideas of the Industrial Revolution itself. But we are well into the first phase here of that revolution. The Industrial Revolution, changes the way people live. It changes the way people work. People are working in factories now and actually suffering a lot more than they were as just farmers working on the farm. Factories are not in good condition. There are no labor laws. So it's kind of a frightening, horrific world that these folks are entering into. So maybe it's a natural response to want to go back and to say, let's get away from this sort of frightening world. And so part of that is maybe rejecting the Enlightenment era world, which was all about improving this and improving that and managing this and being scientific about that. The Romantics are in some senses responding to that Industrial Revolution and the sort of frights and horrors that it brings. But this is also taking place at a time where Europe is really growing. Europe, as we said, is conquering a lot of other parts of the world and influencing a lot of other parts of the world. And one of the things is that, these Romantics, they tend to reject the neoclassical art style, which is more based around the seriousness of the Romans and the sort of precision and the emotionlessness of them. Now, we saw that changing already a little bit with the Baroque art, which had those sort of intense expressions and those emotions. But it changes even more with the Romantic period. And in general, Romantics put a big emphasis on emotion and nature. Nature's the other big thing. They want to get away from society. They're a little bit hippie in a certain way. They want to get away from that sort of hyper-rational and sort of technological world. They want to go out into nature and to feel their souls wake up when they look at a beautiful mountain, a beautiful world. And they try and invoke that kind of beautiful world in their art. And part of that, when I say soul, they are thinking about the state of their soul. A lot of romantics believe in pantheism, which means all God. And it's a philosophy where all of nature is God. God is nature, God is everything. So pantheists believe that they can find God throughout nature. And that's exactly what most romantics tended to believe as well. So if you look at painting like this one, this is by Friedrich, a painter known as Friedrich. And Friedrich paints this young man with a walking stick on top of a mountain, but he's looking out on a sea of fog. That's sort of the attitude that you might have to nature. It's big, it's beautiful, it's impressive, maybe a little scary, but scary in an inspiring way. And here is the sort of lone individual looking out on it and going to interact with it and have a religious or spiritual experience. That's kind of the idea of the Romantics. So let's put a pin in that because I want to talk about the philosophers and ideas of this time period that kind of influence things too. And then we'll come back to painting and how that expressed themes like we see here with Friedrich. All right. So who are the big thinkers of the Romantic period? One of them is Schopenhauer. Now, Schopenhauer is interesting. He is very pessimistic in a lot of ways. He sees there just being a lot of suffering in the world. He identifies something he calls the life will, which is just kind of like all this subconscious instinct that human beings are acting on. And because of that, human beings cause problems for others and other human beings and make life hell for everybody else. So he really sees modern society in his time period as sort of bad and wants to reject it in a lot of ways. And one of the big things he's influenced by is Hinduism, which is the Indian religion that believes in sort of a transcendent philosophy. You can escape your sort of ordinary circumstances and join this sort of universal oneness, this universal God. This is a very pantheistic idea. All things are God, but they don't even put a name on it. It's just all things are one, part of the oneness. And Schopenhauer found that very inspiring. He thought that Europe had a lot to learn from India. And so his goal was to escape into something transcendent. He also put a lot of emphasis on pantheism. A different approach was by a fellow known as Hegel. Now, Hegel is really important in the history of philosophy because so many people were influenced by him. They took his ideas and they ran with him. He can be a little hard to understand, a little confusing, but I think if we hit the high points, we'll kind of get what he's all about. So Hegel sees the world as being inhabited by a kind of divine spirit. Everything in the world is kind of this presence, and you can call it God or you can call it history almost. It is this sort of energy or set of ideas or spirituality is just sort of moving through the world. And as the world changes over time, that's this spirit at work. And the big process of the world changing over time, according to Hegel, is what he calls the dialectic, which is a sort of frightening word. But what he really means is just putting two ideas together, two contrasting ideas together. So he argues that when you have an idea about the world, someone will come along eventually to propose the opposite idea or countering idea. And that is actually how you get progress. So for instance, I don't know, it might be something like taxes are bad, right? So people come along with the idea taxes are bad. That's the American Revolution. And that's point A. And then point B is taxes are good, actually. That's the contrasting view. We kind of went through this in the American history, in the history of America with the original colonists rejecting taxes, and then the taxes in the original Union, the Articles of Confederation, not being strong enough. So they had to upgrade it. So you got A and B, you got taxes are good, taxes are bad, and somehow you have to find a synthesis between them. And so when you put those ideas together, people will think about them, they will consider them, and eventually you'll end up with the synthesis. And the synthesis is the idea that combines those two previous ideas. So the synthesis for taxes might be, taxes are good when they tax these items or in these ways, but bad when they tax these items or tax in these ways. They're good if you tax, the rich, but they're bad if you tax the poor, things like that. that could be the way we could have a synthesis of two heavily debated points. And I suspect a lot of political disagreements, eventually you end up with a synthesis at some point or another where people have to consider the nuances of both sides. And so they end up with a new set of ideas that is more nuanced, at least ideally, right? That's what we would hope for. And so that's Hegel's idea of how history works. That's how the world progresses. And he had seen some progress by his time, and he argued that it would keep moving forward. And ultimately what he believed is this would lead to a utopia. It would lead to an existence for human beings of total freedom, where people could do what they want and live these very happy lives because we were working things out through this gradual process over time. And he kind of had the notion that that might be God or something along those lines. But human beings could accelerate the process through good laws and good ways of thinking about things, ways of doing things. Now, like I said, he was influential on a lot of people. One of them was Karl Marx. We're going to get to Marxism later on. But Marx looked back to Hegel and said, okay, you know, history is a sort of story of progress and finding the right ideas to move forward. I'm going to propose some ideas that are really going to move society forward. And sort of the goal of people is to have a revolution to put those new laws into place. Alternatively, it was also an influence on nationalists, which is not so good. People who believed in like single nations with single ethnic or cultural identities, and tried to make those happen because they saw that as their version of the world spirit. So yeah, kind of complicated thinking about how this guy should be interpreted. He has good legacies and bad legacies, I think, but you can't deny that he's influential. And he's kind of responding to this pantheism almost, but with his own sort of historical pantheism. Now, moving away from the idea of what we think of philosophers to more what we think of scientists, we have someone who's not any less influential, and that's Charles Darwin. You've all definitely heard at this point of the theory of evolution. And by theory, we don't mean it's, you know, something we're not sure of. By theory, scientists mean this is a scientific framework, a theory, a model of the way biology works. Charles Darwin wasn't the first to suggest that there might be some sort of thing along the lines of evolution, but he figured out some really important details. For instance, the idea of natural selection, that animals keep traits that help them survive long enough to reproduce, and things that are disadvantageous is lost. So that would be a mechanism for how species could change over time. It's based on DNA, and it's based on, he didn't know about DNA, but you know, he would say inheritance, and it's based on the reproductive cycle. Now, when he proposed this, especially when he got to sort of the very end of his arguments and his later books, he said that human beings had descended from a common ancestor with other apes. And this was really shocking to people. You think it's shocking now, it was even more shocking back in the 1800s, where a religious view of the universe that saw human beings as the only part of the universe worth considering or respecting, or that human beings had been given a special role by God. They were more important than the animals. They were separate from the animals. And Charles Darwin comes along and he says, oh, well, actually, we are animals. And people did not want to believe that. So that shocked a lot of people because it made humans no longer the center of the universe. On top of that, there were also some scientists who disagreed with him. Not because, I hasten to add, not because there was a better scientific theory that disagreed with evolution, but because their own framework hadn't been worked out yet. Geologists had the idea at the time that the Earth was still pretty young by what we would say modern standards are. That it was, you know, maybe as old as the Bible would suggest it would be, which would be about 6,000 years old, or alternatively, it could be maybe a few thousand years, you know, maybe like 10,000 years, but they didn't think it could be much older than that, in part because they didn't understand the way things changed over time and how plate tectonics and things like that worked. So they had some trouble accepting it as well. And there was definitely, it took some time for enough evidence to be gathered to really prove the theory and nail it down. And by that point, most scientists got on board. But romantics really liked this idea they really liked the idea we are a part of nature, and they found that inspiring. So maybe to some extent the movement came out of that. We are a part of nature, and we are not opposed to nature. This is a very different philosophy than the original Greeks and Romans, who really tried to control nature and say, human beings are smarter than the animals and can use them and can make them do what they want. And unfortunately, there was another group of people who were also very fond of this theory of evolution, which was the social Darwinists. So social Darwinism was an idea that made sense in some people's heads back in the 1800s and even in the 1900s. The idea that they had was that different groups of people, different races, some were fitter than others, some were better suited and more evolved. So this is not the way people would phrase talking about evolution today. There's no such thing as more evolved. There's just evolving to fit different, categories and different things that you can do. And we found that in human beings, there are not really any significant differences in races in terms of, anything that really matters. There's skin color and there's hair color and things like that. But these are this is as far as it really goes in terms of adapting to one's environment. There are genetic differences, but they're all kind of not linked to each other. They're all just kind of random. You can take away skin color and hair color is completely separate from that, things like that. Social Darwinism was barking up the wrong tree from the beginning. And Darwin never said that either. Darwin never said that the fittest people are the best people. He really had no such concept of that. He would just say that people adapted, they evolved in the same way that other species did. They changed over time. But that doesn't mean that that any one group of people is better than any other group of people. Unfortunately, people took it that way. And it was a really influential framework among a lot of racist thinking for a long time, unfortunately. So Darwin had a lot of impact in a lot of different directions. So he's very worth thinking about as a kind of scientist who influenced philosophy. But what I want to emphasize with Darwin is just sort of the beauty he saw in the world because of his understanding of the world. He talked about, the magic and majesty of the whole history of the earth and seeing the whole evolutionary process when you start to understand it. Here's a quote from him. "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." That's the way he saw the world, as this beautiful, wonderful process, all starting from the same beginning. So that's pretty cool. Okay, let's talk about some of the literature of this time period, because the romantic literature was building on some of these philosophical ideas. One of the romantic poets, maybe one of the leaders of the romantic poets, was William Wordsworth, who just has a great name, Wordsworth. You can bet someone named Wordsworth would be a poet. And Wordsworth's ideas his poems were very often about the beauty and wonder of nature. One of his most famous works was about having a direct connection with the universe rather than having somebody else tell you about it. In his poem, "When I Heard the Learned Astronomer," he basically tells this story in the poem of hearing an astronomer have this very scientific description of the stars and how those work scientifically and measuring and everything like that. And then he says that he got up and he went outside and in perfect silence he looked upon the stars. So that's rejecting a sort of scientific way of viewing the world for a more individual experience way of the world, which is a very romantic, in the romantics sense, concept. In his poetry, he also tended to reject the older, more formal ways of doing poetry. We think of poetry that has a very strict rhyme scheme and a very strict rhythm. We think of that as kind of too formulaic or too serious for the most part. We think of that as kind of, for high class people, but not for ordinary people. People like Wordsworth were maybe part of that change because he wanted to use what he called blank verse, which is lines of a certain length the same rhythm in the lines, but not really too much outside of that. They don't have to rhyme. They don't have to be super strict. And so they're free. Blank verse is free of the majority of restrictions, so he can do more whatever he wants with it. It's not quite free verse, which is verse without poem was without any rules, but he had a lot less rules. It was more simplified, and I think his poems have a tendency to feel very relatable because of it. Another one of the literary wild children of the Romantic era was Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley was a sort of, by all accounts, very dramatic sort of person, very beautiful, very handsome. He was a passionate person. He fought for human rights. He was always involved in some campaign or another for liberty or freedom or rights. He wrote a screed, which was called The Necessity of Atheism, rejecting all religion. And so that, as you can imagine, rubbed quite a few people the wrong way. He also really believed in freedom of religion, though. He argued in one of his essays, a Christian, a deist, a Turk, by which he means, a Muslim Turk, and a Jew have equal rights in the benefits and burdens of government. You shouldn't be barred from having a voice in your government just because of your religion. So he was a more modern thinker in that. And he argued that poetry could be a way of thinking about the world, which I think is true. And he saw poets as the thinkers who were helping people advance their ideas. In one of his poems, Ode to the West Wind, he uses the wind as this symbol of creativity, of inspiration filling you. He was married to the author of Frankenstein, who we're going to talk about next time, Mary Shelley. And he died drowning tragically. And she kept his heart shrunken and preserved and kept it in her desk. So this was a very weird couple, as you might imagine from the author of Frankenstein. Speaking of people who died young, one of the most famous poets of the Romantics is Keats. And Keats really believed that life was short. He had lost pretty much his whole family. And then he died at age 25, which is pretty darn young when in the grand scheme of things. And so he saw the world as something that would pass away, that was very temporary. And so a lot of his poetry writes about sort of how temporary everything is and how we deal with sadness. He kind of argued that beauty, that art, help us deal with suffering. We may not live forever, but art can live on after we're gone. And so one of his most famous poems is called Ode on a Grecian Urn, or Ode to a Grecian Urn. And so he describes the mythological characters on a Greek piece of pottery. And then he says that the figures on the vase outlive the people who depicted them. The sort of vase, the vase and mythology and stories and poems, they outlive ordinary human beings. And indeed, in Keats's case, that turned out to be true. He was very prescient with that observation because he died at 25, not too long after he had written that. So he's sort of a tragic romantic, you might say. Another very interesting and very weird romantic is William Blake. So William Blake, he was a mystic. He really had all this sort of religious feeling and these religious speculations. He had wild thoughts about heaven and hell and God. And so he wrote all these out and he illustrated them. He had this whole series of books. There's this whole book that was basically both painting and poetry. He used paintings and engravings and poetry to sort of explain his view of the world and God and everything. And so there's some quite striking images, for instance, here. And he talked a lot about Satan and the nature of reality. And he kind of argued that heaven and hell were one in an ultimate cosmic way. And so he's quite powerful in his work. He was always very opposed to slavery, so he spoke out against that. And in the Bible, he kind of shows, in his Bible, you might say, he kind of shows the sort of horrors of slavery as one of the sort of satanic things. He also did illustrations for the Bible as well. So he was quite familiar with all of that. And he argued or he said that he was getting a lot of what he thought from this angel that was telling him all this information. So take that for what you will. And one of his most famous poems is called The Tiger. And you may have read this one, but I feel like you need to know sort of Blake's as this weird religious sort of mad prophet guy to really appreciate that one. Because when he's talking about the tiger, he has this whole poem about the tiger, and he describes how terrible and frightening the tiger is. And he says, did God make you? Did he who make the lamb make thee? And so what he's saying is not just, in the specific example of tigers, he's talking about the nature of evil. He's talking about Satan, really. When he says tiger, you could substitute that for Satan. So he asks the question, which he was asking all his life, did God, who made, Jesus and made all the good things, make the devil too? Did he truly do that? And he argued that he did. He argued that it was all part of the same sort of mad oneness of God's universe. So that's a pretty cool guy, Blake. Okay, so that's the poetic side of things. And now I want to talk about painting, and then we'll finish up, we'll do the paintings of Europe, and then in the next video, we'll talk about what's been going on in the Americas during this time. Okay, so what would romantics kind of tend to go for when it comes to painting? Well, they love nature, they love beauty, they love thinking of sort of oneness and trying to evoke transcendent experiences. So in practice, what romantics are all about is landscapes. And landscapes that capture emotion, maybe the artist's emotion, kind of conveying a certain mood. Here is one from John Constable, who is one of the romantic painters. And he painted very ordinary scenes. You've got, this pond, these trees, little town in the distance. But, this is all very ordinary stuff. And one of the ways that the Romantics were different from, say, Renaissance painters is that Renaissance painters would tend to make an idealized landscape. They would make it up, basically. It would be a fantasy landscape, imaginary, based on nothing except their own imaginations. Whereas the Romantics really tried to capture something real. And I guess the Baroque period they did too, but they were more focused on humans than landscapes during the Baroque period of painting. And so the Romantic painters are all about going out into nature and capturing something there, and making it beautiful, helping you see the beauty in it. Constable did a lot of stuff like this, and he made it look sort of ephemeral and magical. And he did this by putting white dots all over everything, which is a technique that some people called Constable snow. Just a little subtle thing, and he made the quality of the light look really kind of shimmery that way. Another one of his was Wivenhoe Park. And this is, just showing some cows grazing, but it's beautiful, it captures the beauty of the landscape and the clouds overhead. There's a lot of clouds in the sky, a lot of sky scenes. Another notable guy is William Turner. Take a look at this one and what he does with the light here. We're almost getting into the realm of what's going to be called Impressionism, but we're not quite there yet. But the way light works in these paintings is very sort of flowy and diffused out. And this is just a magical, you can feel like you're right there. You're on the sea, or you're looking out over the sea, watching this fisherman at night with the moon overhead. Another one of Turner's takes on something much darker, which is the slave ship. And again, look at what he's doing with light and color. I mean, I love his colors. They're so cool. The reds and whatnot. But this is a pretty dark painting. You have the sun going down, and look at what's going on in the water here. It's kind of hard to see, but this is the bad stuff that's happening. You have all these hands reaching up and these chains going into the ocean. And so this is based on the fact that when slaves were sick or they didn't survive the journey, or even the slave taker thought that they might not survive the journey, he would throw them overboard, over a ship, and just let them drown. And so this is the horror of that and the horror of slavery. So these romantics are very often, opposed to things like slavery and writing and painting in response to sort of the evils of the world. They are trying to seek something better than this evil world. There was a movement known as the Barbizon School, Barbizon School, and it was all about painting outdoors, and this came out of France. There was a guy, Corot, who was part of the Barbizon School. Here is him. His philosophy is all about capturing snapshots, capturing brief moments. So here's the cow is drinking from the water, and there's the farmers in the background. This is one of his from 1846. Another one from the Barbizon School, Daubigny, the pond at Gaibieu. This is, I really like the look of it. This could almost be a photograph. The colors are more muted than some of these other folks, and it's very naturalistic. They're really capturing some realistic details here. Okay, so that's our exploration. We've done literature and poetry in Europe. In the next video, we're going to briefly check in with what's going on in Asia, if they are exploring any of the same ideas. And then we're gonna move over to America for the rest. All right, see you in that video.